Today we're going to be going over the top 10 most fun yet extremely powerful weapons to use in Elden Ring so that I can give you a whole bunch of ideas to jump back into the game, maybe use something that you haven't for a little while now, and have a blast obliterating every single enemy. Now just before we kick off the list, I do just want to mention that I am not going to be showing you the builds in this video. Yeah, I know, alright, get the boos and everything in the comments. The reason being is because I've pretty much already covered all of the weapons I'm going to show you today, so rather than repeating 10 different videos that I've already made, I'm just going to simply show you the weapons, tell you why they're so fun and so amazing to use, and then if you're interested in using any of the weapons that I show you, you can check out the description down below for the full guides for the best build around each weapon, so you can obviously pick and choose at your leisure. But saying that, we've got a top 10 to go through, so to get things started, in the number 10 spot, we've got ourselves the Fire Knight's Greatsword, an incredible colossal sword that was added in the DLC that not only has a combination of the movesets from both the Godslayer's Greatsword and the Zweihander, making it one of the quickest colossal weapons in the game, but it also has innate fire damage and an incredibly good faith scaling, which makes it extremely deadly. If you also pair this with other Ashes of Wars like the Flame Spear or the Flame Skewer, you can just basically tear up everything in the Lands Between and the Shadow Realm with absolute ease as you just burn everything to a crisp. But where it's still a colossal weapon, you're also going to be breaking enemy stances really easily, staggering most NPCs too, making this a super powerful yet super fun weapon to use. And of course, where this weapon scales best of faith, you can use all kinds of other incantations to match the fire theme, or just any incantation you want if you just pump everything into faith. Again, just adding even more options and versatility when using this particular weapon. And then talking of versatility, in the number 9 spot, I'm actually putting the Rellana's Twin Blades in here. Now I'm just going to again very quickly point this out. If you want a much more powerful version of this weapon, then definitely use the Sword of Night and Flame, because if power is all you care about, then yeah, you can't really argue with this. But of course, I'm also talking about how fun weapons can be, and I feel like the Rellana's Twin Blade is a little bit more fun, especially as again, it's a brand new weapon from the DLC, but it's also one of the brand new weapon types, being a light greatsword. And if that wasn't enough for you, you also mimic Rellana's moveset herself. So if you like Rellana's boss fight and you thought, hey, I wish I could fight like her, well guess what, you can. Much like the Sword of Night and Flame, you've got both an intelligence and a faith side to this weapon, using both magic and fire damage, and for me personally, both of those moves are much more fun and certainly a lot cooler to use compared to the Sword of Night and Flames. They just might obviously not be as deadly as I've mentioned, but they're certainly a lot more rewarding, and the battles are certainly a lot more fun with the Rellana's Twin Blades in your hand. So if you're looking for basically a more fun version of the Sword of Night and Flame, then this is your answer. But fastly moving on to the number 8 spot, we have got ourselves the Euphoria, an insanely fun twin blade that also packs an absolute punch. Twin blades are no doubt my favourite weapon type in all of Elden Ring, so it should come to no surprise that a twin blade would make it into my top 10, and I've purely gone with the Euphoria because although it does have a good faith scaling and also has a good amount of holy damage attached to it, it still is incredibly powerful against most enemies. Of course, if they've got a high holy resistance, then you are going to struggle a little bit more, but it's also the only weapon in the game that has the luster effect, which essentially boosts the damage the more that you hit your enemies. As you're seeing in the gameplay, the more that I'm hitting my enemies, the more the weapon starts to glow, and that is adding additional holy damage to the weapon. And if that wasn't good enough, that's also charging up the Ash of War, which then becomes a holy cannon. Again, with the right build, this weapon can deal thousands of damage in very quick succession, and again is of course extremely fast and nimble with it being a twin blade. And where you get rewarded for basically being extremely aggressive against your enemies, it's definitely a fun way to switch up your playstyle if you're a little bit more conservative. And again, where it's got good faith scaling, you can also apply all sorts of different incantations into your build, so another plus for this particular weapon. But if faith and incantations aren't quite your thing and you're more of a kind of mage or intelligence type person, then the weapon that we have in the number 7 spot might be a little bit better for you, because that is going to be the Wing of Astel, possibly one of the most underrated weapons in the entire game, or at least one that isn't talked about enough, because it probably is actually rated fairly, but it is the literal definition of a pocket rocket. Where it is a curved sword and weighs next to nothing, you would probably think that, maybe it's not going to do as much damage or might rely on DPS to deal a ton of damage. But no, not only does the insane Nebula Ash of War do an extremely high amount of stance damage, but so too does the charged heavy with this weapon, which again shoots out a slice of magic damage hitting your enemies, which again, if you hit them with the sword in the same motion, you'll do even more damage and stance damage, which actually makes this weapon one of the best stance breaking weapons in the entire game, especially against larger enemies, because of course the more Nebula explosions that hit them, the more stance damage you're doing too. But although I'm banging on about stance damage, you're also doing thousands of damage with these attacks as well. So if for whatever reason your enemies are still alive, they're going to get their stance broken, but there's also every chance you're going to defeat them before that can even be a possibility. Also, I'm not really including this in the list because otherwise it would just be a list of pure curve swords, but if you did want to power stance them, that can also be another way to have fun with these weapons, because then you could lean into the DPS side of things. And again, like I say, where it's an intelligence weapon and boosts pretty much all of its damage off of intelligence scaling, you can just basically whack this weapon on to any mage build and still be doing the same damage that you're seeing on screen. And like I said, it's a curve sword, so it doesn't weigh anything, so there's really no bad thing to say about this weapon. And talking of weapons that don't overly have too many bad things to say about them, the weapon that we've got in the number 6 spot is going to be the Star Fist. If you've been a part of the Elden Ring community for at least a month, you have probably heard of the Star Fist because every single YouTuber or every single person in existence has used this weapon in either a speedrun, most overpowered build, or even RL1 runs. And that is because this weapon is the definition of versatility. Not only do you require minimum requirements to wield it, but it's also possibly one of the best strength weapons, and where it's a fist weapon too, it's extremely fast and also has a high amount of stance damage. So pretty much, it's like wielding a greatsword around your knuckles and then just hitting your enemies with that. So if you weren't too much of a fan of the previous weapon because it's intelligence based and you're more of a big bonk kind of dude like myself, then this is definitely the answer. They've also got innate bleed build up, which just adds to how good this weapon is. So if you want to basically try and beat the game as quick as you can, or beat the DLC as quick as you can, just equip these bad boys on, and I'm sure you would have killed all the remembrance bosses by the time that your dinner's done. So if you haven't used them before, definitely get to use them, but I also highly recommend you use this next weapon too, because at the number 5 spot, we've got ourselves Eleonora's Pole Blade. Now, for anybody that has been around this channel since I started making Elden Ring content, you will know how much I love this weapon because, I mean, just look at it, it's freaking insane. But not only does it look insane, it's also possibly one of the coolest weapons with one of the best movesets, especially its unique Ash of War being the Blood Blade Dance, which basically allows you to move into your enemies in the first instant, but then if you chain the Ash of War, you can then attack your enemies as you're getting back out there. So if you get the right timing in, you can jump into your enemies, deal thousands of damage, and then jump back out to safety without the use of your dodge button. But again, like I mentioned with the Euporia, twin blades are my favourite weapon type, and just to give you a heads up, this is the last twin blade in the list, and the only reason why this weapon isn't any higher is just because it does get outclassed in terms of damage with the other weapons that we're going to talk about in a moment. But as I say, it's definitely the most fun that I personally have. I know twin blades aren't for everybody, but where this is my subjective list, if you haven't used Eleonora's Pole Blade, I highly recommend that you do, because not only do you feel like an absolute badass samurai whilst using this weapon, but you do genuinely tear your enemies apart whether they bleed or not. And again, it's just one of those weapons where, because you're going to be so close quarters all the time, it's just extremely satisfying to pull the kills off with this particular weapon. But we're now going to swiftly move things on to the weapon in the number 4 spot, because at number 4 we have got basically any greatsword with Giant's Hunt. Essentially, I am more just pointing out this insane Ash of War, because one thing that I love more than beating our enemies with stupidly overpowered weapons is launching them into the air. I'm so glad that Elden Ring has an item or a weapon that essentially allows you to ragdoll your enemies into oblivion, because if you've ever come up against an enemy on NPC in particular that's extremely annoying, Moongrim, you can get your ultimate revenge by sending them to the moon. But of course, as much as I love this Ash of War mainly for the ragdoll capabilities, it is actually genuinely a really good Ash of War. In fact, it's so good, it even helped me in my RL1 run that we're streaming at the moment, which is another reason why you should be subscribed to the channel, by the way, so you don't miss out on future streams like that, where we're actually stun locking Melania and keeping her basically riposte locked, as where this Asher War also does a butt ton of stance damage, followed by a couple of heavy attacks. Yeah, she just basically couldn't move. And also, big shout out to Katze for even showing me that this method was even possible and showed me the capabilities of Giant Hunt, so realistically, this number 4 spot is all thanks to Katze, so check her out in the description too. But in all reality, against everybody else, it still does thousands of damage, and like I say, still does a good amount of stance damage, so much like everything else in this list, it's still incredibly powerful, incredibly fun to use, and has a really cool gimmick against certain enemies where we can send them off to space like their Team Rocket. But of course, we are now coming down to the top 3 weapons I think are the most fun yet extremely powerful, and to kick off the top 3, I have actually put Dane's Footwork here, because again, although this isn't going to be the most powerful weapon in the game, it has had a load of recent updates and is certainly a lot more viable now, and much like how I love using pole blades because you can basically act as some jacked up samurai, it's actually a little bit more fun leaning into more of a karate style, beating your enemies to a pulp with your fists and feet. Over the last couple of updates, this weapon has been increased in both its poise damage, its speed, and also just its overall damage too, so where they were extremely lackluster when the DLC first launched, they're actually more than viable now and are a great option for, again, another playthrough if you do just want to use your fisticuffs, because all damage that you're going to be doing is all physical damage, and like with the Star Fist and every other weapon that you can change the Ash of War, you can also apply bleed, cold, poison, or even fire damage for certain enemies to make this even more powerful than what it already was. So if you do want to release your inner Jackie Chan or Karate Kid, whack on Dane's Footwork, maybe go and get yourself the Dry Leaf set too, and just go to town on your enemies. Oh, and also Palm Blast is also super fun, because that too can also knock down enemies, similar to that of Giant's Hunt, but rather than sending them to the moon, you're sending them through the wall instead. Of course, that leads us on to the penultimate weapon in this list, and this is basically going to be a representation of pretty much all bleed builds. And yes, I'm aware I've got both the Starfist and Eleonora's Pole Blade in this list too, but when it comes down to ridiculous bleed weapons, you can't look any further than the Blood Fiend's Arm. Not only is it a colossal weapon, but if you put the right build behind it, you can also have a bleed build up towards the 200 mark, meaning every other attack you will proc bleed, and it has a unique charged heavy that does additional bleed damage too. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, where we are not talking about power stance builds, I'm purely just talking about 10 weapons in this list that you can go and pick up and use straight away. This weapon is hands down the best solo bleed weapon, but of course loses out to things like Blood Fiend's Fork and possibly even the Scavenger's Curve Sword with a bleed affinity if you were to power stance them, but realistically you don't need to worry about that, because what the Blood Fiend's Arm lacks in speed, it definitely makes up for in power, because it's again another colossal weapon which will not only deal thousands of damage naturally, but it will also deal a tremendous amount of stance damage. I think it's even in the 50s for a charged heavy attack, meaning that literally 2 or 3 attacks is enough to stance break every single boss in the game, which of course again makes the DLC and everything else an absolute breeze. So again, much like how I was saying about the Starfist, if you wanted to speedrun the game, the Blood Fiend's Arm is now a new competitor to the Starfist. So yeah, for whatever reason you're having a massive problem with a certain boss, just grab this oversized deep fried chicken wing, slap Crackblade on it, and then your problems will disappear in about 15 seconds. But for me personally, that is not the number 1 weapon in this list, of course. And before I do show you the top weapon in this list, I did just want to throw in some honourable mentions, because again, where this is my sort of like subjective list of things that are both fun and overpowered, if you wanted to lean into just more OP stuff and like mind-numbing ways to play the game but just get things done and defeat bosses easily, you can use things like the Blasphemous Blade and the Darkmoon Greatsword. They're of course really good options that fell short of the list just because they're not quite as fun. But then other weapons like the Malekith's Black Blade just shortly fell off of this list, because that is a fun way to play the game, especially making use of the Destined Death abilities, and again just watching your enemy's health bar like deplete in seconds. But I also want to give a shout out to the Magma Blade too, because that's also a very good weapon, weapon, but does require a lot of patience because you do need to farm for it, and it's actually one of the rarest weapons in the entire game. So for that reason alone, like, I didn't include it because getting it is probably not going to be fun, but when you do get it, you can have an immense amount of fun. So if you want to check out builds for these weapons that I've given an honourable mention to, those will also be in the link in the description. But we of course have one last weapon to mention, and coming in at the number 1 spot is going to be Maria's Executioner. Again, a weapon that has been a staple in the game from the very beginning, mainly because it can just one-shot everything, and that is precisely the reason why I've put it in the number 1 spot, because there is nothing more satisfying than depleting an entire enemy's health bar with just one foul swoop. The reason why this weapon is capable of doing so is because if you fully charge up the Ash of War, Eocade's Dancing Blade, you will then hit your enemy up to 12 times in very quick succession, which does indeed proc the successive damage output buffs in the game, and even with the most simplest build, this weapon can have an AR of around about 700 to 800 damage, which of course if you're hitting your enemies with 700 damage 12 times in about 2 seconds, along with all of the buffs that the game has to offer, it's very easy to see how you can do tens of thousands of damage very quickly. And although the gameplay that you're seeing in the background right now is from New Game Plus 7, so I'm not quite one-shotting everything, even with just minimal buffs, I'm still doing almost 10,000 damage because this weapon is just ridiculous, and it is a great sword still, so you can still go around just using its normal charged heavies or regular light attacks and still be able to break your enemy stances and deal the extra damage, as they'll take the extra damage whilst their stance broken. So it can be quite fun to go and get this weapon and just see how many bosses you can actually one-shot. And just to give you a bit of a spoiler alert, if you take this into the DLC, you can actually one-shot most of them, again with just some very simple buffs. So if you want to be one of those players that activates everything, like all the poison buffs, bleed, and also frenzy flame at the same time, I'm pretty sure you can basically one-shot everything that the game has to throw at you. So that for me is why this weapon is at the number 1 spot, and that is my top 10 list of, like I say, the most fun weapons while still being extremely powerful. But let me know what you guys think. Do you agree that these 10 weapons are some of the most fun that you can use in the game, or have I just got this list completely wrong? Obviously let me know in the comments. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. But otherwise, I've said everything that I need to, so thank you so much for watching, and I guess I'll catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.